Hello. We begin today, light in August. It is widely acknowledged today, I think, that William Faulkner is the most significant American novelist of the 20th century and the one who most fully shares the thematic concerns and formal innovations of such European high modernists as Proust, Joyce, Mann, and Woolf. Among American fiction writers of the 1920s and 30s, Faulkner is the most restlessly and relentlessly experimental, the most demanding, the most ambitious. The scope of his work is as vast and complex as the geographical locus of his fiction is confined. Faulkner managed to find all the creative resources and subject matter that he needed in the place where he was born and raised and where he lived most of his adult life, the area around the town of Oxford, Mississippi, which goes by the name of Jefferson in his novels. This region of the Deep South became the inspiration for and the boundaries of Faulkner's fictional universe, a section of central Mississippi that he named Yacoanapa County. It's here, in this area of dirt farms and decaying antebellum mansions and rural hamlets, with Jefferson as the county seat, that he sets nearly all of his novels and short stories, including all four of the extraordinary works he wrote in an astonishing 8-year span of creative productivity and experiment that included The Sound of the Fury in 1929, As I Lay Dying in 1930, Light in August in 1932, and Absalom, Absalom in 1936. Faulkner's family had been prominent members of the community before and during the Civil War, and he enjoyed in his youth listening to his grandfather and his grandfather's friends recount the history of the region, stories that Faulkner found so fertile and thrilling that the sense of the past he absorbed found its way into all of his major work, particularly his conception of the continual role of familial and cultural history operating as a force within the present. Much of Faulkner's education was self-acquired. He was an autodidact. He was a voracious reader, and much of his upbringing came through the care of his African-American servant, the family servant, Caroline Barr, whom Faulkner revered. Of this woman and her race, Faulkner writes simply, "They endured." There is no higher moral assessment in Faulkner's fiction than endurance in the face of what often seems to be an unjust and absurd world. Faulkner enrolled at the nearby University of Mississippi in Oxford, but he dropped out before long, skipping classes often to read or write on his own. He earned, in fact, a D in English as a result of these habits and acquired the unflattering name Count No Count among his peers due to his intellectual pretensions. Too short at 5'5" to enlist in the U.S. Army during World War I, Faulkner instead joined the Royal British Flying Corps in Canada, but he saw no action in combat. Later, he wrote a novel about that particular experience, one of the few outside the range of his Yacoanapa saga novels, called Pylon. And Faulkner, when he returned to Mississippi, married a woman named Estelle and began to try to make his living as a writer. But he had to take menial jobs to make ends meet. One of these, in the later 1920s, when he was already 30 years old, was as shoveling coal in the University of Mississippi power plant. Much of this, his second great novel of that time, As I Lay Dying, published in 1930, just a year after The Sound and the Fury, much of that novel was written during lunch breaks with a pencil and paper on the back of a shovel. Later, in the 1930s, having earned a critical reputation but still in need of money, Faulkner left his family and home in Mississippi to spend time in Hollywood as a screenwriter. There he became friends with the great American director Howard Hawks. In fact, Faulkner wrote screenplays for Hawks' The Big Sleep and To Have Not. And he also acquired, while he was out in Hollywood, a mistress named Meta Carpenter. But Faulkner was always unhappy in California because he missed the South, and this was not the kind of serious writing that he wanted to do. However, one might note that even when Faulkner wrote what he regarded as popular fiction, what he actually spoke of as potboilers, in order to generate cash, even that kind of writing was one in which he invested in it disturbing psychological complexities. Probably most famously in his novel Sanctuary, about a sexually impotent gangster named Popeye who rapes a young woman named Temple Drake using a corn cob. Faulkner returned to Mississippi from Hollywood and then decided that he would never venture very far away again, preferring to work in solitude. And when he wasn't writing, he tended to socialize not with other men or women of letters, but rather with local men with whom he would hunt and fish and drink. He once observed that the ideal place for a writer would be a brothel, a whorehouse, because it would always be quiet there in the morning, which was the time when Faulkner did his best work. Later in the day, Faulkner would drink steadily and heavily. Indeed, he was probably a functioning alcoholic for most of his adult life. And while he was never entirely reclusive, he had a very narrow comfort zone and therefore absolutely no interest in literary celebrity at all. When John F. Kennedy invited Faulkner to dinner at the White House in his honor in the early 1960s, Faulkner declined the invitation, observing that 800 miles was too far to go for a meal. There are, however, two notable exceptions to Faulkner's aversion to travel in his mature years. First, he went to Sweden to accept the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1950 and gave a stirring address in Stockholm at a time when he was still a productive novelist, but well past the phase of modernist brilliance. The second departure was when Faulkner served as a writer-in-residence at the University of Virginia in 1957 and 58, an appointment that consisted of largely question-answer sessions in which professors and students and critics would ask long, convoluted questions about Faulkner's technique and symbolism, and Faulkner would reply characteristically, slyly, with responses like, I wrote that book a passel of years ago and I don't rightly recall what I meant, but you might be correct. That sort of thing. Now, in approaching Light in August and Faulkner's work in general, it helps to begin with a taxonomy of the different social and racial groups who populate his fiction. There are 5 principal groups, I think. First, there is the fallen Southern aristocracy, such as it was or remained in the early 20th century. Faulkner's own family belonged to this group. His grandfather was a Civil War colonel, politician, financier, and local legend. But the next generation that suffered during Reconstruction never lived up to the grandfather's illustrious example, and the shadow of defeat in the Civil War, of disgrace, and most of all of racial guilt hangs over Faulkner's characters belonging to this well-educated, fallen gentry. The primary exemplars of this class in Faulkner's fiction are the Compsons, who he explores in 2 of his greatest novels, The Sound and the Fury, and I think the even greater and more challenging and profound one dealing with the Compsons, Absalom. Both novels explore the legacy of racist guilt that fallen aristocrats have inherited from their slave-owning forefathers. Because for Faulkner, slavery is the original sin, not just of the original South, but the original sin of America itself. And unlike original sin in Christian orthodoxy, not only in the American South, but throughout the country, the moral taint of slavery finds no relief or no redemption. It is an inescapable taint, and it is especially oppressive as a source of guilt for the descendants of plantation-owning Southern whites, those fallen aristocrats, who inherit that guilt both as a familial curse and as a cultural legacy. We see the paralyzing, self-destructive effects of this transmitted guilt, most notably in Faulkner's fiction in Quentin Compson, a young man who was also tortured by psychosexual confusion and guilt. Quentin harbors a tortured, incestuous desire for his older sister, Caddy. And like racial guilt in Faulkner, incestuous desire and guilt recur frequently in his fiction. We see this, for example, in this sister love in Darrell's desire for his sister Dewey Dell in As I Lay Dying, and in Henry Supton's desire for his sister Judith in Absalom, Absalom. And for Faulkner, this peculiar delectation is another distinctive inheritance and source of guilt in the South. The region's long-standing male preoccupation with preserving the virginity of Southern daughters and sisters, according to Faulkner, produced a morbid fetishizing of female sexuality, and in particular of virginity, that leads paradoxically to a perverse desire on the part of these protective men to violate the very virginity of their sisters and daughters that they fetishize. Well, 50 years after the Civil War, Quentin Compson then is a fallen aristocratic figure who is beset by the inescapable guilt of familial and cultural slavery and wartime defeat, and also by the guilt of his incestuous desire for his sister. So much so, under the force of these sources of remorse and guilt, that Quentin commits suicide while he is a student at Harvard, drowning himself in the Charles River. As a member of his family and as a member of his class, he was doomed really from the start. A second group of Faulkner characters are the poor white dirt farmers and tenant farmers of Mississippi. They are often a source of grotesque comedy as they struggle day by day in an unforgiving land of cotton. But sometimes these characters reveal astonishing complexity, like Darrell, for example, in As I Lay Dying, a member of the Bundren clan, whose matriarch, Addie Bundren, dies in that novel and demands burial in Jefferson, which proves to be a 3-day mule ride away, as the Bundrens, led by their shiftless patriarch Ons, struggle with the coffin to reach Jefferson. They pass through flood and fire, and they are themselves the source of pestilence as they move along, because Addie's corpse begins to molder and decay in the Mississippi summer heat. As punishment for attempting to derail this horrific odyssey, the introspective and outcast son Darrell is sent away to an insane asylum, for in truth, his morbid isolation, his sexual guilt, and the horror of the journey he is part of have driven him mad. The other family in this group of poor whites that Faulkner treats within his fiction, and indeed treats in an entire trilogy of novels, is the Snopes family. Unlike the Bundrens, who never advance socially, the Snopes begin as illiterate country bumpkins in the novel The Hamlet, but then they rise through guile and greed to power and prosperity in the novels that follow, The Town and the Mansion. But they make these social gains without ever outgrowing their fundamental vulgarity, racial prejudice, and suspicion of outsiders. Now, Lena Grove in Light in August belongs to this class of poor Southern whites as she walks barefoot in search of the man who impregnated her. But unlike most characters from this group who descend to the level of animals, Lena, as we'll see, maintains dignity. She embraces maternity, nature, and human community in a way very few members of this particular class of poor Southern whites in Faulkner do. At the other moral extreme of this group is the most grandiose figure in all of Faulkner, Charles Sutton of Absalom, Absalom, a man born into abject white poverty in the early 19th century, but one who goes on to acquire money through riverboat gambling, creates a plantation of his own, commands troops in the Civil War, and who, when he becomes a rich slave owner, embodies in his racial subjugation the fundamental original sin of the South. A third major group of Faulkner characters throughout his fiction are white middle-class characters, merchants and small, relatively prosperous farmers. These are church-going, pragmatic Protestants who aren't like their aristocratic neighbors, fallen neighbors. They aren't particularly tormented by their cultural history or racial guilt. They're God-fearing men and women who individually exhibit generosity and neighborly support very often, as Armstead and his wife do, for example, in Aiding Lena Grove. But when they act as a group, collectively, they are capable of often the most poisonous racial prejudice, narrow moral judgment, and rumor mongering. As we're going to see in Light in August, these middle-class judgments victimize both the disgraced minister Gale Hightower and the reclusive Joanna Burden. The fourth group that we find inevitably in Faulkner's world are, of course, the blacks, the African-American descendants of slaves for whom Faulkner feels a deep and abiding sympathy and affection. Some, like Clytie in Absalom, and Dilsey in The Sound and the Fury, are indomitable forces who single-handedly hold collapsing white households together. Faulkner dedicated his great short story collection, Go Down Moses, to the Mammy, so-called, who helped raise him, a woman whom he writes in the dedication to the book, quote, was born in slavery and who gave to my family a fidelity without stint or calculation or recompense, and to my childhood an immeasurable devotion and love. She is the model for Dilsey in The Sound and the Fury. But other black characters in Faulkner, particularly many of his black males, find it harder to endure and remain crippled by fear and shame, which is their own grim inheritance of a century of Southern slavery. The final and most tragic human category, if you will, in Faulkner's fiction are individuals of mixed race, including those who try to pass for white, like Charles Bond in Absalom, and Joe Christmas in Light in August. Individuals who are profoundly isolated from inclusion in either white or black communities and who are bitterly conflicted about their racial identities. They attempt to hide their pasts, but finding no place in the world, strike out against both society and themselves because of their intolerable racial hybridity. This inheritance of racially transmitted hatred and self-hatred on the part of mixed-race characters characterizes Joe Christmas and is at the very heart of Faulkner's vision of human suffering in Light in August. Ultimately, what Faulkner constructs in the five groups that I've described is really a microcosm of humanity itself, and all of this within just a couple of hundred square miles in Mississippi. There are two other groups. We might conceive of them as sort of tangential to the five that I've described, but nonetheless bear mention, if only briefly. First are the Indians, the original inhabitants of the region, who fascinate Faulkner with their purity and wisdom. Characters like Sam Fathers in the brilliant novella The Bear. And the other group are outsiders from the North who have come to the region from New England, typically, and who can never really assimilate. Individuals like the reclusive Joanna Burden in Light in August, whose parents were egalitarian Yankees and who still bears the weight of the racist community's hatred for her parents because of their support of blacks. Thus, her name, Burden, is entirely fitting. She bears the burden of Southern hatred of what her parents represented. But that name, Burden, really would fit all of the major characters in Light in August, all of whom are weighed down by an internalized past over which they have no control and cannot even, for the most part, clearly or fully remember. This is the essential condition that afflicts all characters in Faulkner. In Approaching Light in August now, I want to begin with a feature that, when the book was published in 1932, was a source of confusion and criticism. Its apparent diffuseness, lack of formal unity in any conventional sense. Well, what is it that holds Light in August together? Certainly it's not the focus on the experience or perspective of a single central protagonist, of the kind we get in Confessions of Zeno, or in The Magic Mountain, or in Swan's Way. No. In Light in August, we have three protagonists with three different stories who are introduced in the first three chapters. First, there's Lena Grove, who is traveling from Alabama to Mississippi seeking Lucas Burch, the man who seduced, impregnated, and abandoned her after promising that he would send for her. Second, there's Joe Christmas, a man of mixed race, in a culture where miscegenation, the mingling of racial blood, is an ineradicable stigma. He initially works at the sawmill outside Jefferson, sells moonshine whiskey from his distillery in the forest during Prohibition, and is the tormented lover and murderer of Joanna Burden. And then third protagonist is the former Reverend Gale Hightower, a disgraced ex-minister who came to Jefferson to preach but was ostracized because of the scandal caused by his wife, who in her depression and sexual hysteria took up with men in Memphis and was found dead there after plunging through a hotel window. Now, it's not unknown to have multiple protagonists. I mean, after all, in modernism, one need only look at Women in Love, where we have four protagonists. But Lawrence, after all, brought Birkin and Ursula, Gerald and Gudrun together through continual interaction with one another in generating the novel's plot. But if we look for a comparable integration of protagonists as a plot maneuver in Light in August, as a way of connecting these three central figures in some sort of interdependence of incident, we simply don't find it. Lena Grove and Joe Christmas have virtually no contact with or knowledge of one another at all. And Hightower's connection to those two co-protagonists is limited. He delivers Lena's baby, and he tries and fails to save Joe Christmas's life, but that's as far as it goes. In short, Faulkner subverts our narrative expectations by refusing to make their three stories interlace and cohere. They're three different stories. By contrast, in The Sound and the Fury, we have really one single story but told from four different perspectives, which overlap. Now, you might ask, is there then a thematic unity that binds the novel together in the absence of a single central protagonist and in the absence of an integrated plot? Well, you'll recall that among the elements of thematic cohesion we have seen, in Swan's Way, there was the overriding concern with the experience of time that dominated the novel. And in Women in Love, the overriding concern with the nature and varieties of sexuality. But Light in August, like The Magic Mountain, is a novel with many different themes. But whereas Mann develops his mythic and political and psychosexual themes systematically through a dialectical series of arguments and encounters among the characters, Faulkner's multiple themes emerge in a much less structured and more diffuse way. They recur, these themes, and evolve across the three principal stories, but not in any way that is integrated or predictable, as in Mann. Now, let me suggest at the outset that there are 7 primary themes in Light in August that I'm going to be considering. And you can simply sort of keep these in mind as we move through the novel. First, there is the ineradicable existence of the past within the present, particularly in the form of inherited guilt and trauma. Second, there is the social and psychological condition of alienation, which many of the characters, several central characters, are going to suffer from. Third, there is racial identity confusion, focused primarily on Joe Christmas. Fourth is the relationship between sexuality and violence, again, linked to Joe Christmas, but also to some extent with Hightower. Fifth is the moral failure of Christianity that we'll see pervasively, not just through Hightower, but throughout the course of the novel. Sixth, the power of communities either to sustain or to tyrannize individuals. And we'll see the way in which both operate very differently, say, for Lena Grove than for Joe Christmas. And seventh is the theme of man's relationship to nature. Now, these 7 themes overlap with each other in shifting constellations, but none of them emerges in this novel through the formal dialectics that we find in The Magic Mountain. So although we can admire then the richness of Faulkner's play of ideas, we can't really regard it as a kind of unifying principle within the novel in any structural sense. Nor is there an experimental style in Light in August that provides some kind of consistency. For example, readers familiar with Faulkner's radical forays into stream of consciousness narration in The Sound and the Fury, or familiar with his poeticized interior monologues in As I Lay Dying, will find that the style in Light in August is more conventional and much more accessible. We're not forced to trace threads of mental association, say, in the mind of an idiot boy, an idiot male, like Benji in The Sound and the Fury, which refer to 27 different time frames. Nor do we have to negotiate in this novel turgid oratorical sentences of syntactical complexity and length and Absalom that make some of Proust's sentences look simple. No, distinctive styles like those can, throughout the course of an entire novel, create a sense of stylistic unity as we struggle to accommodate ourselves to them. But in Light in August, certainly among Faulkner's great novels, we find a conventional reliance, for the most part, on an omniscient third-person narrator. Now, the voice of this narrator changes at times and registers itself in different ways as we enter different minds, but the style, unlike that in As I Lay Dying, Absalom, and The Sound and the Fury, doesn't call attention to itself as something that unifies the text through its very distinctiveness. So what then, if anything, binds this sprawling narrative of 3 different stories with 3 different protagonists and manifold themes together? Well, one compelling suggestion is that Faulkner is experimenting with what in music is called counterpoint. Even though Lena Grove and Joe Christmas don't interact with one another, they embody opposing sets of principles that operate in tension with one another, almost in a kind of implicit dialogue with one another throughout the novel, and that touch upon the principal themes that I have identified. But they don't do this interaction with one another, these principles, in the kind of systematic dialectical way we find in The Magic Mountain, where we get Settembrini thesis, naphtha antithesis, and papercorn synthesis. No, and where the ideas are continually juxtaposed with one another in a structure of ideological question and answer. No, rather Faulkner's approach to competing principles embodied in his characters is much more elliptical as a kind of narrative structure. It operates through oscillating contrapunctual relationships among these principles or ideas. And it is that, I think, that is the real experimental feature in Light in August. And it is also this contrapunctual oscillation of ideas, the principle that unifies the novel in the absence of any other. I think we can see the antithetical principles that I've been alluding to most clearly in the juxtaposition of Lena Grove and Joe Christmas as they are first presented to us and as they develop. Lena who is now over 8 months pregnant when we find her on the road at the start of the novel, is the embodiment of maternity, compassionate love, which she practices and also elicits from others on her journey, from those who take her in their wagons to help her on her way, to the romantic devotion of Byron Bunch. As such, Lena, as this figure of embodied love, fosters human community around her, not only by taking food from people along the road who in some way are brought together through her, but also by sharing what she does have. And indeed, she does this unifying, I suppose, also in the very journey itself, because it is undertaken in her pursuit of the feckless father of her child, who she wants to be reunited for, both for her sake and the child's sake. Quote, "I reckon a family ought to be together when a chap comes," she says. Just as she is a woman of love and a woman associated with community, Lena is also a woman of simple faith. Not only faith in God, but faith in the goodness of human nature. And strangers, characteristically, rise to the level of her expectation to assist her, to which Lena characteristically says, "It was right kind of you all." She is a person of simple, elemental appetites, not given to introspection, certainly not to abstract thought, but one who is instead presented as living in close harmony with nature, as that name Grove suggests. Lena is clearly an earth mother herself, who above all things endures as she moves slowly across a landscape that is by turns desiccated and fertile. Now, Joe Christmas, by contrast, is a tragic and alienated man who rebels against a social order into which he cannot assimilate. He is most like Christ, his namesake, Christmas, in his suffering. In fact, Joe's life is a perpetual Gethsemane in which he suffers and rails against the conditions of his mixed race and against the world. He defies all authority, both the law of man and God. In his cynicism and existential rebellion, above all, he is directing his energies against the conditions of his own being. Trapped within his morbid mind, filled with an ontological hatred of himself and society, and seemingly incapable of love, Joe Christmas inflicts violence on both himself and others repeatedly. Especially inflicts violence upon those who try to love him or would love him, because he cannot love himself. Joe Christmas's deepest urge, then, is not like Lena's to foster life, but rather to escape life, to die. Now, mediating the poles of Lena and Joe Christmas, which I presented to you in a schema in my email, but mediating those poles within the contrapunctual structure of Light in August, but in no systematic way, is Gail Hightower, who emerges ultimately as the moral center of the novel. Well, as we prepare to consider the first 3 chapters of Light in August now, I want to address one final feature by way of introduction, and I think it's a crucial one: the novel's temporal discontinuity. Faulkner, as I've noted, is centrally concerned with the past as a shaping force in the present life of each individual. And he reinforces our sense of how inextricable the past and the present are by scrambling time frames throughout the novel, beginning with the opening chapters. Now, here it is important to remember a distinction that I mentioned earlier when we read Proust. That is the difference between fabula, the story or chronological succession of events that one could plot, and sujet, which means plot, not story. Sujet is the sequence in which the reader encounters these events. Obviously, they are very different in this novel. We begin in the fictional present, in August, with Lena Grove on the road, but we get numerous flashbacks thereafter. Through the perspective of Byron Bunch, we are introduced to Joe Christmas's arrival at the sawmill 3 years earlier, that is 3 years before the beginning of the novel and Lena. And we also learn of the arrival of Lucas Burch, father of Lena's child, 6 months prior to the present. Burch has been going by the name of Brown in order to avoid being found by Lena. And in the introduction of Gale Hightower, we go back 25 years to the time of his arrival in Jefferson. And again, through Byron Bunch's perspective, we learn what Bunch has heard from older townfolk about the ex-minister's arrival and his fall from grace. All right. In Chapter 2, we get a thumbnail history of the lonely spinster Joanna Burton, whose family came from the North 60 years earlier during Reconstruction, were persecuted as lovers of Negroes, and whose grandfather and brother were murdered in the town square by an ex-slave owner. Okay. Now, at the end of both chapters 2 and 3, we return to the fictional present. Lena arrives and meets Byron Bunch at the sawmill on Saturday afternoon as the murdered Joanna Burton's house burns and the smoke goes up. And Burch also then goes to visit Hightower in his dim little house the following Sunday night, returning in these instances to the fictional present. Now, although Byron Bunch is not one of the novel's 3 central characters who are introduced in the opening 3 chapters, he is a witness to each arrival and thereby provides a kind of continuity as we move across several time frames, as I've just described. Time frames which, as we move through the novel, we begin to try to plot along a line that would constitute a fabula. Now, the most radical and sustained movement back into the past comes, as we'll see, in the center of this novel when we get Joe Christmas's history for several chapters, beginning with his early childhood. These chronological disruptions are common in Faulkner. We find them also in Absalom, and they're meant to emphasize the way in which the past continually obtrudes and reemerges in the present in uncontrollable ways, just as the past suddenly intervenes and we get flashbacks, again, at different stages of history in the course of the present narration. These chronological disruptions, then, are absolutely related to Faulkner's sense of the presence of the past in each moment. But it's not the past as we find it coexisting in the present in the way we have it in Proust, which is to say it's not the past as Bergsonian layers of subjective memory that are stored within the individual mind. For Faulkner, the shaping past is not contained in or transmitted by either willed memory or involuntary memory, nor, for the most part, is the memory and the past he's interested in something that is simply a matter of personal history. It is partly that, but it is much more, as we'll see. Indeed, when Faulkner's characters try to reconstruct their personal past, as Quentin does in Absalom, they find that they distort and reshape it unreliably in accordance with their private needs. Nor is Faulkner a believer, like Thomas Mann, in racial memory as something arising from a collective unconscious and structuring our experience and defining our identity as human beings in a sustaining way. In short, neither personal memory, as in Proust and Woolf and Joyce, nor mythic memory, as in Mann and Lawrence and Joyce, provide a basis for sustaining selfhood in Faulkner. Instead, in Faulkner, the inherited and familial and cultural past, that is to say, the past inherited from our family and from our culture, shapes us and haunts us and binds us, and finally serves as our destiny. In his bleakly deterministic vision of this past as an inheritance stored within us, it is stored not as conscious memory, not as racial memory, but rather as a kind of emotional and instinctive memory. Assimilated history manifests itself primarily not in conscious recollection or even thought, but rather at Faulkner, this assimilated historical memory, family and cultural past manifests itself in feeling and in attitude. And it doesn't emerge in disclosures as it does, say, in Proust or in Mann, but rather this past that has been absorbed and accumulated is a continual shaping present. Most of all, this kind of emotive memory of a familial and cultural past takes the form of inherited shame and guilt and fear. Those are the feelings that accompany it. Those are, in a sense, the feelings that define and characterize the past in the present for Faulkner. Well, this is a complex psychic legacy, as I've suggested, that for Faulkner we inherit partly from our family ancestors and partly from our culture, from society at large, certainly in Faulkner's case from the American South. And it can also be shaped in part, as we'll see with Joe Christmas, not just by family history and the history of the region, but also to some extent by one's very, very early, almost preconscious upbringing, none of which we can control and none of which we can alter or overcome by understanding or examining its sources, even when characters attempt to do that. As Faulkner puts it at the start of Chapter 6 in Light and August, memory believes before knowing remembers, believes longer than recollects. That is, we absorb memories as the truth of our existence instinctively before we ever know them as memories. Our cultural and familial past is stored within us as in the form of inborn attitudes and feelings that we only grasp later, mostly intuitively. Now, this kind of memory Faulkner refers to here is a subliminal legacy, then, that we acquire before we ever really become conscious entities. And this strata of absorbed memory is deeper and endures longer than any of the conscious recollections that we may acquire and that may grow out of it. Thus, the inherited past for Faulkner is always with us, even when we're not consciously summoning up our personal experience. That experience is shaped by what we cannot see. Each moment of our lived experience is woven through with the thread of this omnipresent familial and cultural inheritance. As Faulkner once famously put it, the past is never dead. In fact, it isn't even the past. Now, instead of showing characters then enacting and sometimes discovering their mythic identities, as we see, say, in Mann and in Lawrence, Faulkner reveals a different sense of destiny. It is often, but not always, a tragic destiny, and it arises because of the circumstances that the characters face in life, which have, in a sense, been written long before they were ever born. In, say, for example, As I Lay Dying, the very condition of birth itself becomes a kind of destiny. Addie Bundren reacts differently to her children, one after the other, with responses ranging from nurturing love to complete rejection, and that is one of the primary forces before they ever become conscious of who they are or where they are that shape what they become. Now, some individuals, of course, never become conscious of the forces that have shaped their life, even dimly. Others struggle to try to discover it, only to find that there are severe limits on what they can know and understand about the familial past and the cultural past. Characters like Joe Christmas and Joanna Burden and Gail Hightower, who are introspective in that respect and to try to interrogate and parse the conditions that have from the past translated into the present, find that they not only can't fully understand them, but they can't do anything to change their destinies. This deeper sense of inevitability, then, this deeper sense of destiny as beyond one's capacity to choose or align oneself with it, is what makes Faulkner's fiction in many ways, I think, so deeply tragic. But it also, the sense of destiny that his characters feel, even if they can't trace or understand it, that sense of destiny in his characters accounts for the way in which they often have the proleptic sense that something is about to happen, but that it feels as if it has already happened. They feel as if the script has somehow been written and the event has already therefore been experienced prior to its occurring. Consider, for example, Lena's experience of this as she walks in search of Burch. And as she is moving along the road, she hears a wagon coming in the distance before she even sees it. And we're told the wagon seems to come slow and terrific and without meaning, as though it were a ghost traveling a half-mile ahead of its own shape. That far within my hearing before my seeing, Lena thinks. She thinks of herself as already moving, riding on it, again thinking, then it will be as if I were riding for a half-mile before I ever got to the wagon, before the wagon even got to where I was waiting, and that when the wagon is empty of me again, it will go on for half a mile with me still in it. Note that Lena's sense of the present is so infiltrated with a sense of her future destiny that she feels she is already in the wagon, moving toward Jefferson before the wagon ever arrives, indeed before she ever sees it. She only hears it. Now, Lena cannot formulate Faulkner's idea about time in words, about the way in which everything in a sense already been written, but she does nonetheless feel it, and the narrator explains it this way when he speaks in this same passage of the road itself, with all the peaceful and monotonous changes between darkness and day, is like already measured thread being rewound onto a spool. Both Lena's experience on the road and her destiny, then, have already been measured and are winding and unwinding on a spool each day quite beyond her control. Just as Lena has inherited the generosity and the steadfastness of her parents, who thought of her welfare even as they died, so too the destiny of Lena's unborn child is also being written in advance through its blood inheritance from Lena, even as she walks along the dusty road. She is thinking of the child, protecting the child. We're told she had been doing that now for almost 4 weeks. Behind her, the 4 weeks, the evocation of far is a peaceful corridor paved with unflagging and tranquil faith. Back-rolling now behind her, a long monotonous succession of peaceful and undeviating changes from day to day and dark to day again, through which she advanced in identical and anonymous and deliberate wagons as though through a succession of crack-wheeled and limp-eared avatars, like something moving forever and without progress, a cross and urn. The description here alludes to one of Faulkner's favorite poems, Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn, in which an ancient vessel, an urn, is decorated with scenes of the past brought mysteriously to life in the present in such a way as to make the present seem somehow timeless, a composite of the present and the ancient. Now, note how Faulkner reinforces the sense of time as Lena's sense of time as already written and being lived out as destiny in his narrative handling of time here, as Lena is walking. After she sees the wagon, we loop back in time in the narrative, maybe half an hour earlier, to Amstead and Winterbourne, okay? They see Lena passing on the road as they squat on their hams discussing farm equipment. Armstead gets into his wagon, catches up with Lena further down the road, indeed it was his wagon that she heard, and he picks her up. But to get to this point, narrative time has had to loop back on itself. We already know at this point that the driver will pick Lena up because Lena has seen, heard, and then seen the wagon coming before we know it is specifically Armstead who is driving it. Thus, the reader is given a sense not only of destiny in the inevitable arrival of this wagon, in this small temporal dislocation, but the reader is also made to think of the past, of what has already occurred, as coexisting in the events we read about in the present. Now, Armstead, who envisions how his wife will react to Lena before they arrive at his house, comes upon Lena as she is soaking her feet by the road. It's an early sign of Lena's close familiarity and connection with nature. She is a woman of simple thoughts and natural appetites, who the next day uses the money that Armstead's wife gives her from her savings in order to buy sardines in a country hamlet. She is drawn to food, and the thought of these sardines dominates everything else. Varner thinks that she is thinking surely of her scoundrel who deserted her in trouble and whom they believe that she will never see, save his coattails perhaps already broad, flat, and running. But no, Lena is not thinking about that at all. She's thinking about the coins knotted into the bundle beneath her hands. She is remembering breakfast, thinking how she can enter the store this moment and buy cheese and crackers and even sardines if she likes. Lena delights in food, while we see that Joe Christmas responds to food with guilt and violent aggression. For Lena, food is the element of life itself, just it is the food from her own body with which she will nourish her child. And for Lena then, food is absolutely essential, in part because as she moves along, she is eating for two, as she walks and rides in yet another wagon toward Jefferson, where she has heard that Lucas is working at a planing mill. Thus, we're told that sitting in the wagon, she eats slowly, steadily, sucking the rich sardine oil from her fingers with slow, complete relish. Then she stops, not abruptly, yet with utter completeness, her jaw stilled in mid-chewing, a bitten cracker in her hand, and her face lowered a little and her eyes blank, as if she were listening to something very far off or so near as to be inside her. Her face is drained of color, of its full, hearty blood, and she sits quiet still, hearing and feeling the implacable and immemorial earth, but without fear or alarm. Its twins, at least, she says to herself, without lip movement, without sound, and then the spasm passes and she eats again. Note that as the baby kicks inside Lena while she's eating, Lena feels the earth beneath her and feels the earth within her, because she is, in her imminent motherhood, so close to the earth as the source of life and sustenance. She is an earth mother. She has already spent, after all, 8 years raising her brother's children, beginning when she was little more than a child herself. By the way, the novel's title, Light in August, refers explicitly to Lena during the 10 days in August, the month, which are the fictional present, but it has another meaning as well. To be light in local Southern parlance means paradoxically to be pregnant. Thus, she is light in the month of August. Mrs. Armstead, who is a mother herself, views Lena with, quote, an expression of cold and impersonal contempt, at least at first, because she regards Lena as being so foolish in allowing herself to get present, and also she is contemptuous of Lena's professed trust in a scoundrel, Burch, who is clearly trying to get away from her and his unborn child. Yet there is an innocent vitality in Lena that even Armstead's wife cannot resist. Lena is naively trusting to a point, but she is not a radical prelapsarian creature of complete innocence, which is to say, Lena is not incapable of suspecting evil. In fact, she's sufficiently suspicious and fearful that Burch has abandoned her, that she not only sets out in search of him without knowing at first where he is, but she also has to deceive herself about that in order to sustain the search, which suggests, of course, the very need to deceive herself that she has been suspicious. She thinks to herself, remembers, you just send me your mouth word when you are ready. I told him, I'll be waiting. Yes, said he'd come back. It was him would have all the trouble of being among strangers, and me with nothing to bother about except just waiting for him while he had all that bother and trouble. Yeah, but after a while I reckon I just got too busy getting with this chap in me to his time to worry about what my name was or what folks might think. But me and Lucas don't need no word promises between us. It was something unexpected come up, or he even got sent the word, and maybe it got lost. So one day I just decided to get up and not wait any longer. Thus she rationalizes it. Clearly, however, she has had doubts. Now, as Lena nears Jefferson, after having ridden in so many wagons and walked so many miles from Alabama, as she nears Jefferson at the end of the chapter, she sees the smoke in the distance rising from what we later learn is the fire at Joanna Burden's house. But little does Lena suspect that the man she seeks has, in fact, been living on that remote property. She's soon about to find out, though. Now, our introduction to all three principal characters in this triptych of a novel is, at the start, largely from the outside rather than through their own individual perspectives. There are moments of it, yes, of the kind I just noted, but for the most part, we see them from other points of view or from that of the third-person narrator. The omniscient narrator reports, for example, what Armstead sees, what Byron Burch sees, witnesses and remembers, but we don't get very far inside the minds of Lena, Joe Christmas, or Hightower in these first three chapters. That is going to come later. But when Christmas first appears in the chapter in which he is introduced, he is presented to us only as a kind of sinister outsider from the collective point of view of those who see him, including Byron Burch. Byron Bunch knows this. It was one Friday morning 3 years ago, and the group of men at work in the planer shed looked up and saw the young stranger standing there watching them. They did not know how long he had been there. He looked like a tramp, yet not like a tramp either. His shoes were dusty and his trousers were soiled too, but they were of decent serge, sharply creased, and his shirt was soiled, but it was a white shirt, and he wore a tie and a stiff-brimmed straw hat that was quite new, cocked at an angle, arrogant and baleful above his still face. He did not look like a professional hobo in his professional rags, but there was something definitely rootless about him, as though no town nor city was his, no street nor walls nor square of earth his home, and that he carried his knowledge with him always, as though it were a banner, with a quality ruthless, lonely, and almost proud. They did not know who he was, but Byron Burch realizes that he's going to remember seeing this man. Now, much of what we register in this first impression that comes through Byron, and in a sense also through the group of men around him, much of what is registered here proves to be accurate. Joe Christmas is indeed rootless, sullen, contemptuous of all groups. He is self-alienating, rebellious, silent, and prone to aggression, all of which are hinted at in this introduction. Only later do we learn why he is this way. His name, Christmas, is as baffling to the community of men, where he's hired to shovel sawdust, as is his behavior. Indeed, we're also told that that job of shoveling is one usually reserved for blacks, though they do not know that Joe is in fact part black. There's wild surmise about him. Is he a furriner? Did you ever hear of a white man named Christmas, the foreman said. I never heard of nobody tall named it, the other said. Now that was the first time Byron remembered that he had ever thought how a man's name, which is supposed to be just a sound for who he is, can be somehow an augur of what he will do if other men can only read the meaning in time. Again, the sense of destiny. It seemed to him that none of them had looked especially at the stranger until they heard his name, but as soon as they heard it, it was as though there was something in the sound of it that was trying to tell them what to expect, that he carried with it his own inescapable warning, like a flower its scent or a rattlesnake its rattle. Although Joe Christmas's complexion is, we are told, the color of dried parchment, No one suspects at first that he is part Negro. Instead, the other men take him to be a foreigner, and it is only his whiskey-making partner, Burch, a.k.a. Brown, who betrays Joe's racial secret. So there is both unintended irony, then, and also foreshadowing in the comment, "Did you ever hear a white man with that name?" Well, he's not a white man. The men whose observations in this introduction to Joe Christmas function like a kind of chorus in Greek tragedy as they render these judgments and speculations, and are struck by the incongruity of the name Christmas for this man, because it's a name that normally implies joy and renewal, but which, combined with Joe's menacing manner and alienated appearance, seems to convert that name Christmas more into a warning not to approach him than anything that would be life-affirming or joyous. Apart from Joe Christmas, the second chapter also introduces us to three subordinate characters in the novel. First, there is Byron Bunch, who remembers seeing Christmas on his first arrival. He's a middle-aged man who has given up on love until he sees Lena Grove, as he is working overtime and alone on Saturday because he has no social life. Yet, like Christmas, with his still and his mixed race, both of which are secrets, Bunch has his own secret life. We learn that he finds solace by leading a country choir and also by meeting on Sunday nights with the even lonelier disgraced Reverend Hightower in his unpainted, man-smelling house. But then Byron meets Lena when she walks into the mill in search of Byron Bunch and in search of Lucas Burch, and Byron Bunch's life changes almost from the moment he sees her. Lena Grove walked into the door behind her, her face already shaped with serene anticipatory smiling, her mouth already shaped upon a name, because she thinks that this man whose back is turned to her is, in fact, her lover. He hears her and turns and sees her face fade like the dying agitation of a dropped pebble in a spring. "You ain't him," she says behind her fading smile with the grave astonishment of a child. "When I got close to town, they kept a-calling a bunch instead of Burch, and then I just thought they was saying the name wrong, or maybe I just heard it wrong." "Yes, ma'am," says he. "That's what it is. Bunch, Byron Bunch." With the stave still balanced on his shoulder, he looks at her swollen body, her heavy loins, at the red dust upon the man's heavy boots upon her feet, and we're told that as he gazes at her, he seems to fall in love. Now, note, why does this man, whom love has given up on, as Faulkner puts it, suddenly fall in love with Lena Grove? Well, it's partly because she is, as he realizes, like him, solitary and determined and honest, and it is partly because she is innocent and cheerful. But what he loves most in her, as he sees it almost immediately, is that he recognizes Lena has been victimized and deceived, but that she goes on, that she endures her plight with grace, including not just the discovery that this man who she thought was her lover when he turns around is not, but more important, she endures and goes on after the painful discovery that the disreputable man and bootlegger called Brown is in fact her faithless lover. Now, the fact that Byron Bunch has inadvertently led Lena to this painful discovery, and that he has therefore unintentionally contributed to her pain, that fact only increases his love for her, a love that is both compassionate and romantic, as Faulkner describes it. She is watching him. She is not even blinking. "And he says his name is Brown?" Lena asks. It might have been a question, but she does not wait for an answer. "What kind of tales have you heard about what they do?" I would not injure any man, Byron says. I reckon I ought not to have talked so much. For a fact, it looks like a fellow is bound to get into mischief soon as he quits working. What kind of tales, she says. She's not moved. Her tone is quiet, but Byron is already in love, though he does not know it. He does not look at her, feeling her grave, intent gaze upon his face, his mouth. When he raises his face now, he finds that he has looked down again before he even met her eyes. He seems to have already a foreknowledge of something now irrevocable, not to be recalled. Who had believed that out here at the mill, alone on Saturday afternoon, he would be where the chance to do hurt or harm could not have found him? But here it is. And then she asks, "Oh, brown, yeah, tall, young, dark complected. Women folks," Byron said, calls him handsome. "A right so do, I heard tell. A big hand for laughing and frolicking and playing jokes on folks, but Here his voice ceases. He cannot look at her, feeling her steady, sober gaze upon his face. "Joe Brown," she says, "has he got a little white scar right here by his mouth?" And he cannot look at her, and he sits there on the stacked lumber when it is too late, and he could have bitten his tongue in two. Well, Byron feels what Faulkner calls a foreknowledge of something again. Again, a sense of destiny as he listens to Lena ask these questions. But he also feels a sense of guilt when he sees how the discovery that this disreputable individual who is bootlegging is the man she's been pursuing. A painful discovery for him as for her, because we're told he could not look at her. He could have bitten his tongue for inadvertently causing her to come to this conclusion. Now, in a novel concerned with isolation, Byron, like Joe Christmas and Hightower, is a largely marginalized figure who operates on the outskirts of the Jefferson community rather than within it. But he is not so extremely isolated, not so completely alienated as another secondary character who was also introduced in Chapter 2. And that is the middle-aged recluse to whom I have already alluded, Joanna Burden. Of her, we are, by way of introduction, told, "She lives in a big house alone, a woman of middle age. She has lived in the house since she was born, yet she is still a stranger, a foreigner whose people moved in from the north during Reconstruction, a Yankee, a lover of Negroes, about whom in the town there is still little talk of queer relations with Negroes in the town and out of it, despite the fact that it is now 60 years since her grandfather and her brother were killed on the square by an ex-slave owner over a question of Negro votes in a state election. But it still lingers about her and about the place, something dark and outlandish and threatful, even though she is but a woman and but the descendant of them whom the ancestors of the town had reason, or thought they had, to hate and dread. But it is there, the descendants of both in their relationship to one another's ghosts, with between them the phantom of the old spilled blood and the old horror and anger and fear." What is the outlandish, lingering it that Faulkner speaks of here? This force that keeps a woman in an old house where she was born, on the outskirts of the community, that irrationally hates her because their ancestors hated her ancestors? What binds her to this terrible place? Well, it's partly an inherited sense of outrage and grief, a compulsion for racial justice, a family legacy that she can no more give up or escape than Joe Christmas can escape his hatred of Southern society and of himself, or than the community of Jefferson can cast off its racial prejudice or its resentment against her as a child of the family that came there and fought on behalf of blacks. All of these things are ineradicable, notwithstanding the agony and the pain and the conflicted feelings of guilt and rage they may produce. Now, the third subordinate character we encounter in this second chapter is Lucas Burch, of whom we have already heard a good deal before meeting him. Like Joe Christmas, he is a newcomer who is as rootless as Christmas. But unlike Joe, he is not a character of depth or inner complexity. He is rather superficial, cowardly, and so lazy that he is compared to, quote, a worthless horse who's always got a sore hoof when hitching up time comes. Lucas delivers to town the whiskey that Christmas distills in the woods. But he himself has no skill, no direction of any kind, only a desire to escape all forms of responsibility, including responsibility to Lena. Faulkner describes this unworthy man whom Lena seeks so relentlessly as like, quote, the transparent and weightless shell left behind by a locust, oblivious and without destination upon whatever wind. Yet because Lucas is a man without a conscience, he is dangerous. He's narcissistic. He's an opportunist who, having betrayed Lena, will also betray Joe Christmas without compunction. It is the lack of conscience that makes him capable of anything. Well, from the introduction of Gale Hightower in Chapter 3, we are confronted with another mystery of residence, not unlike Joanna Burden's peculiar need to stay in a place that is so rooted in familial misery and trauma. Why does Hightower continue to live in the town that took away his ministry and covered him with shame 25 years earlier? Well, in the opening introduction, I think, two reasons for his continued residency there emerge. First, as Hightower forces himself to sit listening to the sound of the congregation at a nearby church on a Sunday evening where he once presided, we realize, I think, that one reason he stays in this place is to punish himself. As he sat and still sits by the window, the room still dark behind him, he could hear in the August darkness from a distance, quite faint, though clear, he can hear the sonorous waves of massed voices from the church, a sound at once austere and rich, abject and proud, swelling and falling in the quiet summer darkness like a harmonic tide. In listening, Hightower is atoning for his failures as the pastor when he assumed that role right out of the seminary. The public shame that had caused him to hide his face behind a hymnal as he was driven out of his church, that was not sufficient punishment. He must add more. His private guilt holds him in this place of disgrace for failures both to the people and also to his wife. With regard to her, we learn that, oh yes, the friend would say, Hightower, he lives there by himself. He came here as a minister of the Presbyterian Church, but his wife went bad on him. She would slip off to Memphis now and then and have a good time. About 25 years ago, that was, right after he come here. Some folks claimed he knew about it, that he wouldn't or couldn't satisfy her, and that he knew what she was doing. And one Saturday night, she got killed in a house on something or Memphis, papers full of it. He had to resign from the church, but he wouldn't leave Jefferson for some reason. His remaining there is a mystification to the other members of the community as well. Note, Hightower's wife went mad. As we'll discover, she was depressive, she was a hysteric, and she was also, it appears, a nymphomaniac. And yet, so consumed was Hightower in his own ecclesiastical romance that he neglected her and failed to save her, for which he blames himself. The fact that she disrupted a sermon and ran screaming toward him in church, shaking her fist at the pulpit, suggests that she blamed him somehow for his failures toward her. But Hightower, who insisted on coming to Jefferson, knows that he also failed the community of worshipers through a kind of self-indulgent mixture of scripture with the drama of his family history in this part of Mississippi, an exalted idea of himself as the heir to this grand, tragic legacy of the Civil War that fits his name, Hightower, because he somehow sees himself as elevated by this Southern legacy. But that name Hightower also emphasizes the precipitous fall that his unholy mixture of Southern romance and Christianity produces. The young minister was still excited, even after 6 months, still talking about the Civil War and his grandfather, a cavalryman who was killed, and about General Grant's stores burning in Jefferson, until it did not make any sense at all, using religion as though it were a dream in the process, not a nightmare, but something which went faster than the words in the Holy Book, a sort of cyclone that did not even need to touch the actual earth, and the old men and the women in the congregation did not like that either. It was as if he couldn't get religion and that galloping cavalry and his dead grandfather shot from the galloping horse untangled from each other, even in the pulpit. Again, a family legacy exercises an ineluctable force over the individual. In this case, his absorbed idea, not a personal memory, but just some sort of idea passed down from generation to generation of his grandfather in this glorious struggle against the North, in a heroic death. This vision of his family rootedness in the area is the seed that cannot be expunged and cannot be controlled as Hightower remains in his sequestered isolation. His religion and his grandfather being shot from the galloping horse got all mixed up, as though the seed which his grandfather had transmitted to him had been on that horse too that night and had been killed too, and time had stopped there and then for the seed, and nothing had happened in time since, not even him. The dramatic religion that Hightower preaches in his sermons is not the Presbyterianism that this Southern congregation demand or expect. What they want and expect is Calvinism, with its emphasis on man's sinfulness and the dire doctrine of predestination, a nightmare of threatened damnation, not this grand romance of good and evil, of North and South, that Hightower is presenting because he's so infatuated by this legend of the family history. Hightower's congregation wants to be reminded that most of humanity is damned and that only the elect are saved, that is, themselves. This is not what he's preaching. Well, after his dismissal from his role as pastor, the local Ku Klux Klan tie Hightower to a tree and beat him on the trumped-up suspicion that he was having sex with the black man who did his cooking. But he still, even after that laceration and demonstration of hatred, still remains, and even delivers a black woman's child when no one else is available. When Byron Bunch asks Hightower why he remains in the town, consider Hightower's elliptical response to the question. Byron still wondered why the other remained in Jefferson, almost within sight of and within hearing of the church which had disowned and expelled him. And one evening, Byron asked him, "Why do you spend your Saturday afternoons working at the will?" When Byron asked him, Hightower said, "Why do you spend your Saturday afternoons working at the mill while other men are taking pleasure downtown?" Hightower said, "I don't know," Byron said. "I reckon that's just my life. And I reckon that this is just my life too," the others said. What is Hightower's life? Well, it is, as I've suggested, a perpetual act of contrition, a habit that binds him to the place as a force of guilt that he again and again finds himself punishing himself to overcome. But paradoxically, he also stays there for the second reason that still abides. and that is because of that continuing fatal fascination with the place as the site of his grandfather's glorious exploits and death, almost a kind of martyrdom in Hightower's view, during the Civil War. The inheritance that had infected his sermons and became such a monomania that he neglected his wife. Therefore, a kind of inheritance and obsession that is inextricable from his guilt, and yet just as he clings to the guilt, he still clings to the glorious idea of this family legacy as well. On Sunday evening, as he waits for Byron Bunch to arrive, we're told that, quote, the echo of phantom hooves of his grandfather still crashed soundlessly in his dusk-filled study, even as he listens to music from the church where he used to preach that causes him deliberately pain. These phantoms that he hears, no less than Hightower's guilt, then bind him to this place. Bunch understands this from his own experience, and he sees it in Hightower's and formulates it memorably when he says to himself, a man will talk about how he'd like to escape from living folks, but it's the dead folks that do the damage. It's the dead ones that lay quiet in one place and don't try to hold him that he can't escape from. Them dead ones being the entire history of the region and the entire history of his family. It is a pronouncement of the destiny rooted in the familial and cultural past that fits Joanna Burden, that fits Joe Christmas, just as it fits Gail Hightower. Okay, that's all for today. Second lecture on Light in August next time, and you will be receiving, with this, have received, I hope, your paper